Hi, and welcome to Week 13, Part 2, where we continue our discussion of Impressionist artists and Post-Impressionism. Mary Cassatt is the only American artist to be identified and exhibit regularly with the Parisian Impressionist movement. Before moving to Paris to pursue independent art study, Cassatt studied at the Pennsylvania Academy, but became disillusioned by the dismissive attitude toward female artists that she found there. Cassatt studied under several artists in Paris and eventually, after returning briefly to the U.S. during the Franco-Prussian War, opened her own studio, which she supported, sometimes with great difficulty, through sales. Cassatt was an outspoken supporter of the avant-garde, and even though her work had been accepted by the Academy Salon, she publicly decried the system as corrupt and as taking advantage of women artists. In 1877, when she for the first time had no works accepted by the Academic Salon, she was coaxed by her friend Edgar Degas to exhibit with the Impressionists. Degas and Cassatt were good friends who critiqued one another's art and traded ideas, including in the realms of technique and composition. Cassatt adopted at first the broken brushstroke technique of Monet and Pissarro, as you can see in Reading, but soon expanded her style in interesting ways. Cassatt and Degas were both interested in ukiyo-e prints, and especially in Japanese compositional techniques, like cropping off figures or objects, placing objects close in the foreground, using patterns to flatten and abstract objects and people, and viewing scenes from a bird's-eye perspective. In Woman in a Loge, we see the influence of ukiyo-e in the setting as well as the composition, which is taken from an interesting angle. At first, it doesn't reveal that what we are seeing is a woman sitting in front of a mirror, with part of her reflection visible. We also see that despite social prescriptions, Cassatt dared to take her sketch pad out into the world. The bath displays Cassatt's internalization of ukiyo-e elements, such as patterns, on the dress, the floor, and the wall, and the bird's eye view. Maternal Caress is one of Cassatt's many experimental forays into printmaking and reflects even more the influences of ukiyo-e as well as the artist's desire to abstract her subjects with flat color and patterning. Edgar Degas' work, too, was heavily influenced by ukiyo-e. Like Cassatt, he started out as a copyist at the Louvre Museum and also came from a well-to-do means. His family, however, became bankrupt shortly before opening of the society, and being unhappy with the Academy, Degas joined the Impressionists and exhibited with them frequently. He was also frequently blamed for the rift between its members in later years, and Degas was described by several contemporaries as argumentative, grouchy, and relatively conservative in his critique of modern art. Degas explored several subject matter types throughout the years, most of which were painted in his studio. Unlike most other Impressionists, Degas did not enjoy painting en plein air and felt it was a pointless pursuit. Yet many of his works take place outside the studio. For example, he created many paintings of ballerinas in class or on stage. But an initial visit to a school or stage would be followed by many hours of models posing for the artist in the studio. The spontaneous quality of rehearsal on stage, for example, is almost entirely artificial, drawn from the imagination of the artist. Other works, such as The Millinery Shop, here, and The Absinthe Drinker, show people engaging in modern French activities. Milliners were hat makers, and this was one of several low-paying professions that were performed almost exclusively by lower-class women of Paris. Absinthe is an alcoholic drink made from wormwood that was addictive and hallucinogenic, reflected in the expression of the woman at the bar. Degas painted these lower-class and so-called seedy members of society from models and friends, rather than from actual encounters with lower-class people. These two paintings, along with The Tub, display Degas' interest in abstraction stemming from observation of ukiyo-e Japanese prints. In Millinery Shop, for example, go back to that, we view the scene from above, a bird's eye view. The hat of the milliner is working on is cropped off. The central hat nearly blocks the view of the central figure, while its placement and vivid green color of the tie of the hat tend to flatten out and give an abstract quality to the composition. In Absinthe, the point of view is similarly unexpected. The two figures appear to be more towards the back right edge of the picture plane, and the unusual point of view from above allows the white bar tables to flatten out and abstract in the composition. They have the effect of making our eye see white trapezoidal shapes, around which the rest of the composition is arranged. After the height of the Impressionist movement in the 1870s and 1880s, interest in that particular trend declined. Yet no single unified movement took its place. We'll explore the varied avenues of post-impressionism shortly, but let's take a moment to see in what directions some of our Impressionist artists ventured at the end of the movement's fluorescence. Some call this period the Impressionist crisis. This term is usually at least twofold in its meaning. On the one hand, during the early to mid-1880s, the Impressionists were exhibiting with one another less frequently, and as a group they had drifted apart. The early Impressionist interests set aside in favor of new interests of artists like George Seurat. On the other hand, the crisis may refer to a sort of personal philosophical crisis that seems to have been experienced by many of our Impressionists as they enter the end of the 19th century. As a movement that was founded on rebellion against the establishment, and the academic salon in particular, Impressionism found itself in the odd position of being largely acceptable to the Paris art world. Impressionist artists were regarded as masterful, and their work was no longer controversial on its face for its style or its subject matter. Therefore, Impressionists were now establishment artists, not the avant-garde rebels they had once been. This aspect of the Impressionist crisis is also considered by postmodern scholars to be the first crisis of modernism in art, a subject we'll explore in depth in the last two chapters of the book. There's yet another arm of the Impressionist crisis that we can consider. The late work of artists like Edouard Manet, Claude Monet, and Pierre-Auguste Renoir are often interpreted as displaying a shift in artistic philosophy that betrays a sort of panic about the artist's place in history. This theory can probably explain the shift in some artists' work better than others. I'll present 3 examples for you and allow you to make up your own mind. First, let's look at one of the last major works by the artist who started it all by directly defying the Academy Salon in 1863, Edouard Manet, and what we're looking at is the bar at the Folies Bergère. Folies Bergère is, like many later post-impressionist artists' work, a view of a modern, popular night spot frequented by Parisians and international visitors alike. It is densely populated with busy figures in its background. Though it's difficult to discern at first, you may see 2 green feet dangling from the upper left corner. This is the trapeze artist that everyone has come to see perform. This activity is combined with still life on the bar and in the mirror, which we'll see in the vast majority of the scene, including the background. In fact, the mirror is a complicated addition to the composition. At first, many viewers are unaware of it, as the reflection behind the bartender does not match up exactly with the rest of the work, including the bartender herself. She's reflected off to the right, over here, and looks quite different in her reflection. She leans in to listen to the mustached man, who we can take to represent the viewer. Yet, the real bartender, who's directly in our line of sight, is not looking at us, and does not appear to be very attentive, certainly not leaning in. While we can see many a bored female club employee in Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art treated as any other subject in a painting, it seems like Manet is actually aware of and commenting on this woman's circumstances. These factors combine to make Folies Bergère an interesting and complex work. Many interpret Manet's ambiguous use of a bar as a commentary on the lifestyle depicted. Others interpret this to be an unusually sympathetic and complex treatment of a female subject. In any case, The Folie Bergère is quite different from Manet's previous works, but it certainly provoked discussion on par with his Luncheon of 1863. For Claude Monet, the crisis meant a change in his approach to the subject. He seemed to be more obsessed with a practice he performed casually at the beginning of the movement, painting the same objects or scenes in different weather or light. He painted dozens of compositions of haystacks, cathedrals, and water lilies. The light reflections became more and more fragmented, creating a more abstract effect, as in Rouen Cathedral. His paintings of water lilies turned highly abstract, especially when Monet would eliminate the shoreline from the image, tightening up on a patch of the water's surface, like here. Some attribute this shift to problems with Monet's sight, and these problems do seem to have affected his color usage. However, a visual disability cannot account for his honed focus on light, on color, and the effects of atmosphere and time on both. Some interpret his brushstrokes as more expressive in his later career, which might reflect the influence of Vincent van Gogh or other post-impressionists. Lastly, we look briefly at a late work by Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Renoir's late work is easily discerned from his earlier work, as he worked extensively on the subject of female nudes. Renoir's return to the nude, as it's sometimes called, is not really a return for the painter himself, but instead the return is to a more classical or academic approach to art. It's believed that, at least in part, Renoir started painting more nudes because it established a connection between his body of work and the so-called great canon of European art going back to the nudes of classical antiquity. One problem the Impressionists found was that their work was very topical and located in space and time. It was difficult for some Impressionists and their contemporaries to perceive Impressionism as having universal appeal, or to believe that their work would not grow outdated as the modern clothes and activities of their subjects started to look old-fashioned in the coming decades. Even though Impressionists wanted their work to be topical, to be located in modern times, they faced this potential crisis as their works aged. The shift in Renoir's subjects is believed by many critics and art historians to be a reaction to this inevitability. Nudes, especially female ones, are seen as timeless, eternal subjects, as we have seen in our own journey throughout art history this semester. Renoir, then, is using the female nude to cement his place in art history. Think about how different that is from Manet's use of the female nude all the way back in Luncheon on the Grass. Post-Impressionism is the period of time after the height of Impressionism in the late 19th century. Post-Impressionism is not a style or movement on its own. In fact, Post-Impressionists are often, though not always, independent, working out their own individual styles as they react to the avant-garde work of their predecessors. While this collection of varied reactions to Impressionism by individual artists was not unified in the least, it can be perceived as collectively spurring on the early 20th century Modernism movement. Overall, the Post-Impressionists went much farther than Impressionists did in their avant-garde tendencies. Post-Impressionist artwork is more abstract and more expressive than that of their predecessors. Post-Impressionist work is more experimental in use of color, texture, and line. Their exploration of subject matter is usually more thoughtful, more inward-looking than the Impressionists. But we must remember that without the Impressionists, Post-Impressionism would not be possible. Without the independent attitude of the Impressionists, their avant-garde will, and their new focus on the modern, Post-Impressionists would not have reached the heights of expression and abstraction that they did. Once more, the crisis of late Impressionism is not some tragedy to be mourned, but instead a point of stagnation, as you would find in the development of any important movement, and an opportunity taken by Post-Impressionists to move further and faster than ever before. While it is true that Post-Impressionism is not a unified movement, still we can see trends and similarities in their work that allow us to generalize about this time frame. For one, While Impressionists believed art should imitate nature, Post-Impressionists believed art should reconstruct nature. Rather than interpreting what they saw according to light and color, most Post-Impressionists reinterpreted nature, and in an abstract way. Through use of color, texture, and line in particular, many Post-Impressionists created compositions that sometimes resembled Impressionist technique, but their interpretation of what they saw utilized the artist's imagination. This new emphasis on abstraction will accelerate later in the 20th century. In addition to intensifying abstraction, many Post-Impressionist artists were highly emotionally expressive in their works. Most Impressionist artists or artist pieces could be seen as observational. If Impressionists did impart emotion, it was often only that which is observed. For example, between a mother and child in a Cassatt work. On the other hand, Post-Impressionist artists seek to express their own emotions through their artworks, whether they're landscapes, self-portraits, or portraits or figure groups. This is often achieved through the abstracting manipulation of color, texture, line, and other elements. Like abstraction, the Post-Impressionist emphasis on expression will also be highly influential on early 20th century art. In fact, these two ideas, abstraction and expression, are so key to understanding Post-Impressionist art that many Post-Impressionist artists are categorized by art historians as either formalists, interested in abstraction, or expressionists, interested in emotion. While many Post-Impressionist artists could easily be pigeonholed in this way, like Vincent van Gogh or George Seurat, none of them are clearly dealing with only one issue or the other. Expressionists use formal techniques to get their content across, while formalists express ideas, though often rather emotionally cool ones, through their use of formal techniques, as we'll see with George Seurat. Paul Cézanne's career reads as if it is a caricature of a rejected modern artist's life whose strange innovations are unwelcome until near after his or her death. Cézanne's career began slowly as a relatively unsuccessful impressionist. Cézanne exhibited with the group just a few times, but he soon realized that his work was taking him in a different direction. He gave voice to the idea of the Impressionist crisis, stating that he wanted to give Impressionism the substance that he felt it lacked, a gravity that would get it into the museums at last. Though he certainly did not contribute much to the success of Impressionism, and despite a lack of recognition during the majority of his career, Cézanne contributed greatly to modernism and is now recognized as one of the most influential artists of the late 19th century. Cézanne's style certainly differed from other Impressionists. Rather than spontaneously applying broken brushstrokes, Cézanne preferred to carefully arrange the marks in what were usually somewhat geometric shapes and patterns. In viewing his many versions of Mont Sainte-Victoire, which we can see two of which here, or any of his other repeated copies of landscapes, you can see the development of a new view of the world. Cézanne was attempting to order what he was seeing according to triangular and square planar shapes, applied often with the flat edge of a square brush, which you can really see in this version. Rather than rendering the world as he saw it, he was rearranging it according to abstract aesthetic principles. He even used this technique in portraits and figure groupings like the large bathers. The flesh of the figures is rendered in broken brushstrokes, very different from the soft dabbing of the Impressionists. The hallmark of Cézanne's style, the use of geometric and flat shapes, was really unpopular during the late 19th century. He also used space in strange and unusual ways, an innovation which also was unpopular. In his basket of apples, Cézanne appears to show us the still life from at least two, if not more, points of view. The left and right sides of the table don't even appear to meet behind the tablecloth, which you can see here. Some things appear to be viewed at level and others from above. This approach to art demonstrates a new understanding of the artist's role. Cezanne saw the purpose of his work as not reflecting reality or controlling reality, but instead completely reworking it so as to create a new reality. Many now realize that this fundamental difference in how Cezanne thought about art, though unpopular at the time, signaled the beginnings of a major shift in Western art theory and criticism. While some contemporaries realized that this playfulness with space was part of Cezanne's reordered view of the world, others did not understand and thought such idiosyncrasies were mistakes or the result of poor training. And why not? For no one really else in the West had ever so deliberately altered such fundamentals of realism, such as spatial perspective, in such a disorienting way. And this is why Paul Cézanne becomes so important near the end of his life in the early 20th century, when finally other artists, the Cubists, also sought to so aggressively abstract the world around them. If we can categorize Paul Cézanne as a formalist, then Georges Seurat certainly belongs to that same camp. Seurat, too, exhibited with the Impressionists, although only at the end of the movement's heyday. Seurat is often categorized as an impressionist by art historians, but an overview of even one or two of his works reveals very different goals and ideas from his impressionist fellows. Seurat is now best remembered for the technique which he popularized, divisionism, which is frequently called pointillism today. Divisionism was an experiment in optics, the inquiry into how we see light reflected off the world around us. Seurat liked the visual effects of Impressionism, which tended to see the world as flickers of light and color bouncing off of surfaces. But Seurat wished to take a more scientific approach to optics. He chose a palette of pure colors, from which he could make any color or effect. These 11 pure colors, as he called them, would be arranged in dots or points when viewed up close, where they would look very abstract. But when viewed from a few feet away, these would reveal images and solid colors. Divisionism then attempted to divide solid colors into an array of tiny dots of a variety of colors. Seurat's largest and most famous example of divisionism is Sunday on the Island of La Grande Jatte. This painting looks like a collection of rather solidly rendered figures within a landscape. The scene even looks impressionistic, with modern-day Parisians out on a Sunday outing. But clearly, Seurat's focus is on the work's divisionism. In fact, this work has been criticized for the lack of emotion, action, interaction, or even variety in the figures, virtually all of whom are seen in profile view and have a statue-like appearance. It is a visual and formal tour de force disguised as an impressionist painting. The emphasis on form, on the surface, over content was not entirely accepted by Seurat, who felt that through the use of color combinations and line, one could create emotion-inducing harmony. But it's clear that the subject matter made very little difference to Seurat. Vincent van Gogh was, like Paul Cézanne, an artist who was not appreciated during the height of his career, or indeed during his lifetime. Unfortunately, mental illness caused Vincent's life and career to be cut short. But the brief but prolific 10 years that the artist worked were, like Cézanne's later career, highly influential on the direction of art in the coming early 20th century. Van Gogh was born in Holland and spent time there, in Belgium and England, before eventually arriving in France, where he spent the rest of his short life. Vincent spent his early life in a variety of careers, from art dealing with his brother Theo to teaching to missionary work. His work and personal lives seem to have been quite quirky and spotty from a contemporary standpoint, and many accounts are very unflattering personally, characterizing him as unreliable, emotionally unstable, alcohol abusing, and/or sickly. Van Gogh studied painting privately and then at the Academy in Antwerp, Belgium. His early works were often dark in palette, like the Potato Eaters. During this period, there was some interest in his work through Theo's art connection, but little came of this. The Potato Eaters and other early works demonstrate an imaginative approach to subject matter as well as shape and line that will still be reflected in his later works, though they will look quite different. When Van Gogh came to France in 1886, he discovered the Impressionists and gained access to the works by the old masters, as well as ukiyo-e prints, which influenced him deeply. He had little money and relied on his brother for art supplies and sustenance, yet he was highly productive, creating a number of avant-garde pieces that explored color and texture in new ways during these, which happened to be the last few years of his life. The Sower, for example, utilizes acidic, unnatural colors, as does this version of the Sower. Look at how green that sky is. His self-portraits, like the one we just saw here, use color and texture in experimental, abstracting ways. The background looks solid at first, but it's actually alive and teeming with texture to such a degree that it's difficult to appreciate in a photograph. In the night, there it is. In the Night Cafe, Van Gogh uses line, texture, and color to describe an emotional connection to the world, perhaps one that he was unable to make in his interactions with people. His new work was so exciting that even Paul Gauguin, a cynical impressionist exhibitor who generally detested Van Gogh, agreed to stay with him in a country studio in Arles so that they could work and feed off of each other. Unfortunately, Van Gogh reportedly attacked Gauguin not long after his arrival, and so their collaboration was very short-lived. The expressive qualities of Van Gogh's work culminated in the Starry Night paintings. The texture and color of these works seems alive and, like Cézanne's paintings, seems to reorder the world. But rather than a scientific or a geometric approach, Van Gogh's work always had an emotional quality. His most famous Starry Night is the one that he reportedly painted from his hospital window while in Saint-Rémy. The painting is admired by modern and contemporary art historians for the curling shapes surrounding the stars and the moon, and the textured countryside, which demonstrate the imagination as well as command of composition that Van Gogh possessed in his last few years. Although his brief career did not lead to success during his lifetime, Van Gogh's work, and especially the high value he placed on expression, continue to influence artists today. We'll end our section on the late 19th century with a look at Paul Gauguin and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Paul Gauguin has already been mentioned as a member of the Impressionist group and as an acquaintance, but not a close one, of Vincent van Gogh. Gauguin started out in the banking industry, but after losing a lot of money, he abandoned his family and pursued painting full-time. Like most post-impressionists, Gauguin had his own unique style and his own ideas and philosophy about art. Gauguin is credited with beginning the synthetist movement. Gauguin defined synthetism, which means a philosophy of synthesizing ideas and emotions, as a style that was emotionally powerful yet decorative and involved flat patterns and large flat areas of color. Synthetism also romanticized so-called primitivism, the idea that native peoples of non-Western cultures, such as those occupying the French colony Tahiti in the Pacific, where he spent the later years of his life, that they made artwork and lived a life that was somehow more primal, uncivilized, and real than life and art in the West. This type of romanticism, rooted in, frankly, racist and uninformed assumptions about non-Western peoples, was common among educated artists in the late 19th and early 20th century. Synthetism and its combination of the abstract and the mystical was quite influential on other late 19th century artists, including the symbolists, who count Gauguin among their ranks. Primitivism in Gauguin's work involved abstraction and heavy outlining, which he perceived to be non-Western artistic elements. He also idealized native Tahitians in his works. When Gauguin arrived in Tahiti, he was apparently surprised and disappointed to realize that a colonized nation didn't usually retain its native primitive customs and costumes. While the vast majority of Tahitians were made to follow Christianity and dress in Western clothes, Gauguin paints them as nude or with little clothing, along with some references to native spirituality, but most of which grew from his own imagination. It's easy to criticize Gauguin for his ignorance, however. Visually, his compositions are very innovative and deftly combine the abstract and decorative with the representational. In Day of the God, for example, the scene is divided into three horizontal zones, which go from completely non-representational here at the bottom, at the bottom, to more abstract in the center, and then to more realistic at the top. Lastly, let's take a look at the work of Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Toulouse-Lautrec was one of many late 19th century artists who followed a bohemian lifestyle. The bohemian lifestyle, which focused on expressive arts, love, philosophy, and adventure, contrasted with the upper middle class bourgeois lifestyle against which many artists were rebelling and within which most of them grew up. Toulouse-Lautrec was himself the child of a count and countess, but by choice lived the majority of his life in the seedy Montmartre district of Paris. Montmartre was a hub of bohemian theater, nightclubs, and art, but it was also a poor neighborhood known for having a large number of brothels. Toulouse-Lautrec pursued painting as a career starting at a young age, and at about 18 went to live in Montmartre. Toulouse-Lautrec is perhaps best remembered for his lithographic posters advertising the famous nightclub Moulin Rouge. You can see one of Toulouse-Lautrec's dozens of posters on the screen. It advertises the performer Jeanne Erville, who is shown dancing the can-can, for which the Moulin Rouge was famous. Because he used lithography, Toulouse-Lautrec's posters were lively and spontaneous-looking compositions. He had clearly been influenced by Degas. Note the similarity to Degas' Rehearsal and other Impressionists, but like other post-Impressionists, he created his own style. In his lithographs and paintings, Toulouse-Lautrec employed a style that utilized contour lines and sketchy drawing and painting. Like Degas and Cassatt, Toulouse-Lautrec cropped his figures and other objects on the edges of the picture plane, like in at the Moulin Rouge. Similarly to Van Gogh and Gauguin, Toulouse-Lautrec used color in an expressive rather than realistic way. Toulouse-Lautrec's lively drawing and painting style constituted a unique approach to typically late 19th century subjects such as theater, nightclub performers, and prostitutes. Unfortunately, the lifestyle to which he dedicated his art got the better of him. Toulouse-Lautrec had a number of health issues throughout his life stemming from genetic problems. His aristocratic parents were first cousins. His most visible physical difficulty was the shortness of his legs, which was the subject of much derision and pain. Toulouse-Lautrec died of complications due to alcoholism and syphilis at the young age of 36. Due to the length of this module, I did not review the information on French sculpture or other trends in the late 19th century, like symbolism, Art Nouveau, or the arts and crafts movement. Please rely on your book for information about these trends, and feel free to approach me with any questions.